Hi, welcome to the Semantics lecture about VP internal subjects. When we say VP internal subjects, we mean just that, subjects that are inside the VP. And this will not require too much of a change. Essentially, we're just going to put our subjects in at a more convenient spot. But there's a lot of good evidence for this, and it's going to help us understand a little bit better the link between the syntax and the semantics of argument structure and the syntax and semantics of the inflectional structure, which is higher up in the structure. So, basically the idea for VP internal subjects is that they start low and then they raise high, and we can see that in this tree here. And what that means is that for our VPs, we'll have the object here, and then the subject will be in specifier of the VP projection. And then in languages where it needs to be in TP, then it will have to move there. Now, what is the evidence for this? Well, there's a lot of good evidence, and three of the points that were brought up here by McCloskey involve different syntactic and semantic diagnoses. So the first one is coordination, right? So we can coordinate a clause that is we can coordinate a clause that has an active subject and a passive subject. So like the sentence here. In 2 or in 3, so the girls will write a book and be awarded a prize. Now we know with passive subjects that they originate low and raise out of VP. But since we've coordinated this, the structure falls under the coordinate structure constraint, which requires movement out of both conjuncts at the same time. So if it's moving out of the passive one, it's got to be moving out of the active one. If it's moving out of the active one, then we can conclude that the subject was in the VP to begin with. Another fact involves quantifier float. So quantifier float would be a sentence like the sentences in 3, where you could put the DP subject high in the structure and leave the quantifier low in the structure. So they must have all been drinking wine. It's a good example of that, where all is down in the structure. Now this is an interesting phenomenon, but one of the curious facts about it is that you can't put this floated quantifier just anywhere. Right? If you look at the distribution in 5, we'll see that you can't put it too low. You can't put it between the verb and the object, and you can't put it after the object in English. Well, why not? And then there's the other question of interpretation. Right? If all is a quantifier, then it takes 2 properties as its arguments. But the first one is this VP they. The second one would be the verb phrase. But if the DP they is way off at the front of the sentence, then how did it become the sister of all? Well, simple solution. It needs to be in 2 places. Classic syntactic solution is movement. Right? It was the sister of all at one point, and then it moved away. That's another argument for quantifier, for VP internal subjects. That is to say, the VP, the subject starts inside the VP. You can imagine all as maybe a quantifier phrase, and raises out. Now, there's case issues that we won't get into, but the idea is pretty simple, that it was down here and moved out. And since it was here, it also explains the other question, because since it can't be down here, it can't be down here, and that tells us that the subject doesn't originate down here. Well, we already hypothesized that. The idea is that it is in the specifier position. Right, so we handled those facts pretty easily. A third fact involves quantifier scope, or a phenomenon called reconstruction. So look at 9. Every player didn't score. Now, in English, that sentence is actually ambiguous, even though on the surface, the universal quantifier has scope over negation. Every player didn't score. That would be every player such that they didn't score, which is the same as no player scored. But if you look at 9b, you get the sentence that it is not the case that every player scored. That is to say, maybe some of them did. And that's acceptable in English. And in fact, I think it's even the more common reading of that sentence. But it raises a question, right? If scope is related to C command, then as an LF, not has to C command every. But if every player originated above not in spec of TP, then we would have to have some kind of lowering. But we can't have lowering for independent syntactic reasons. We don't lower in the syntax, we only raise. So this has to have been originally below negation, right? And the VP internal subject hypothesis gives us a location. There's three arguments in favor of VP internal subjects, right? There's the coordination, quantifier float, reconstruction, and there's a number of other pieces of evidence as well that we've seen. You might have come across here or there. There's a lot of evidence for it. And it also makes more intuitive sense, right? Because what we'll see is that we'll have the inflectional layers with aspect, negation, tense, modality, and all these other things that add on to the predicate, that tell us about the events or the predicates. But here we just have the arguments of the verb, right? The actual participants. And so we're not separating the subject by putting it way up here, we're keeping it down low. And essentially, we're going to get rid of those first. We're going to deal with those first. And that's a bit more intuitive. And it will help us start to divide the grammar, the syntactic structure, into these fields, as they're called, where we have the argument structure, then the modality, then the inflectional structure, and then the more discourse-oriented things at the very top. Right, so that's the VP internal subject hypothesis. It's pretty much accepted now, 30 years or so after it came out. And well, for our purposes, it's going to be very little change because we just build a VP here, and then we'll just add the subject here. It will be a little bit of a change for intransitive verbs, because now we'll have to build them up to VP and then add the subject. Right? And we'll see that we don't have to always do that, but we'll have to do that for now. And add the subject like this. So we'll have to add a node. But other than that, no real consequences. It's just that now we can motivate a more intuitive semantics, and we'll be using those kinds of structures going forward.